Hello viewers, today we are going to be talking about Muslims in contemporary India. Now who are the Muslims? Muslims are individuals who follow the Islamic faith, and we are going to talk about their social situation and various aspects of their lives being and becoming in contemporary India. I will begin with firstly a little bit of statistical data about the population of Muslims in India. So according to the 2011 census, 79.8% of the population in India practices Hinduism. So Hinduism is the dominant religion in India, and 14.2% adheres to Islam. So 14.2% of India's population constitute Muslims. On the basis of religion, there are, of course, other communities in India as well. So the remaining 6% that we have adheres to Christianity, Sikhism, Buddhism, and Jainism, and various indigenous ethnically bound faiths. Christianity is the third largest religion in India. So at the very onset, it is important to understand that in India you have a multiplicity of faiths, and they have always existed. Right? So when we are talking about a particular community, we always have to keep this in mind, that India is a secular nation, which of course with a dominant population of Hindus, but it has a sort of a multi-dimensional population in terms of religion. Now, when we are trying to understand the specific experience of Muslims in India, we have to take into account certain historical events that have shaped the lives of Muslims in this country. And one very important event that shaped the lives of Muslims in this country, and which is absolutely essential for our understanding of their experience in contemporary India at the present moment in the 21st century, is obviously the partition. Now, as you know, that the partition moment is a very important moment because it is associated with the birth of the very Indian nation, and it is the moment of India's independence. So as you know that in 1947, two nations were formed out of colonial India. One was India and the other was Pakistan. Now, Pakistan was established as an Islamic state, whereas India was established as a secular nation without an official religion. Now, this aspect of the formation of Pakistan, and as you know that the history of partition is also a violent history, so this history affects the ways and experiences of Muslims in the Indian nation following partition. So there was a lot of anxiety around the Muslim identity at the point of partition because they got associated with separatism. The call for a separate state, which would be a religious state, is something that got associated with Muslims. So Muslims got caught in this dichotomy between the nation and the community, right, which also sort of translated in the understanding of sort of nationalism on one hand and separatism on one hand, secularism on one hand and communalism on the other hand. So it is important to understand that when partition happened, a lot of Muslims did go to Pakistan, and often these were scholars have pointed out that a lot of these Muslims had what is called mobility capital, which means that it was possible for them to move towards East and West Pakistan at that point, which is sort of now Bangladesh. But the remaining who were there, they obviously imagined an allegiance to the Indian state. However, because of the experience of partition, what happened was there was a kind of anxiety around the status of Muslims as Indians, precisely because of the creation of Pakistan. So the question was that would Muslims who have now got a nation of their own be loyal to the Indian nation? And these anxieties were articulated, say for instance, in the context of military. So say if the Indian nation is going to have a military, it will obviously have Muslims who would be there in the as military men. So now the issue was, will they be on the side of the nation, or will they be on the side of the community? Right? So this whole issue of who will Muslims support became a kind of anxiety for the Indian nation, and that led to this understanding that Muslims have to prove their allegiance to the nation. Right? So there was a kind of otherization at the very historical moment of the birth of the nation, where the Muslim identity became a slightly more complicated identity in terms of their relation to the Indian nation. Now, of course, this is in terms of the larger historical context. There is no reason to assume that Muslims who stayed back did not feel patriotism for the nation. In fact, most Muslims who stay back in India obviously demonstrate nationalism, right? But in order to understand their situation, particularly their political and economic situation, it is important to understand the fact that this partition had certain consequences. For instance, because of this kind of partition, when the constitution was being framed, it was very clear in the mind of the constitution makers that they are going to frame laws in such a way that there will be no special privileges which will be accorded to any particular religion, including the religion of the minorities, right? So that separatist tendencies do not emerge, right? So when the constitution was framed, there is a very interesting turn that the constitution takes in terms of the kind of safeguards that it provides to minorities in India. Right? And what we see is that there is a different way in which the Indian constitution approaches the issue of minorities and the way in which it approaches caste backwardness. Right? So the constitution acknowledges that, in India, all individuals are not equal. In fact, there are a range of discrimination even within, say, for instance, Hinduism, there is a practice of caste, etc. So because it wanted to develop an equal democratic nation with social justice, the understanding was that it will require, to give equality, there will have to be certain forms of affirmative action that the state will have to partake in. So what the constitution did as a result is that it established laws which clearly stated that the constitution can have reservations or effective action solely on the basis of caste, or there were reservations for tribes. So as you know, the two categories that were produced were the ST, that is the scheduled tribes, and the SC, which is the scheduled caste. Here reservation was given solely on the basis of caste status and not religion. Now, the Indian state was also sensitive to the fact that there wasn't an equitable distribution of different kind of ethnic and religious groups in the country. As I pointed out to you, that it's a nation which is dominated by the Hindu population. So the framers of the constitution were concerned about how to safeguard and protect minority communities in India so that they do not feel minoritized, they do not feel marginalized and oppressed, right? So in this sense, there were certain constitutional safeguards which were extended to minorities. Now, the minorities basically include religious, cultural, as well as linguistic minorities, and the term has undergone various changes. Say by the late 90s, there was a very clear-cut idea of, who is a minority, etc. Of course, Muslims constitute a kind of permanent minority according to the state in contemporary India. And there are certain safeguards that Muslims as a religious community get from the constitution. I would like to read some of the constitutional safeguards that Muslims as minority and all other minority groups have as a part of an Indian nation. These include, for instance, Article 14, which is equality before the law. So it's the right of equality. Next is Article 15, which is prohibition against discrimination, and it clearly states discrimination on the grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, and place of birth. So, minorities, including Muslims in India, cannot be discriminated and have to be seen as equal citizens of the country. Because India envisaged itself as a secular country, there were certain religious freedoms which were also given to all religious groups of the nation. These include Article 25, which is freedom of conscience, free profession, practice, and propagation of religion; Article 26, which is freedom to manage religious affairs subject to public order, morality, and health; Article 29, which talks about the protection of interests in regard to language, script, and culture. As I mentioned, that minorities are not just about religion but also about linguistic and cultural minorities. Article 30 is right of minorities to establish and administer educational institutions. And finally, Article 32, which is the right to constitutional remedies, which is in a situation a minority group feels that any of the rights that I have mentioned so far have actually been taken away from them in India, then they can of course go to court and fight for their rights. So these rights guarantee and imagine Muslims as a part and parcel of the Indian nation. In talking about the experience of Muslims in India and sort of talking about their contemporary situation specifically, it is important to understand that while I'm talking about Muslims, it appears as though they are a singular, monolithic, homogeneous community. But the first thing that we have to understand that when we are talking about the 14% of Muslims who are Indians, we are actually talking about a range of differences. Muslims are not equitably distributed across all states in India. There are some states which have a high percentage of Muslim population, for instance, West Bengal and Kashmir, and there are states which have a very small percentage of Muslim population. So their population is not equally distributed. Secondly, the way in which Muslims practice their religion is also very, very different. And it isn't that there is one standard way of Muslim religious practice. There are various divisions and subdivisions in terms of religious performance. So sometimes, what may happen is, apart from the stereotypes that we may have of how a Muslim appears to be, and these are of course faulty stereotypes, like we tend to imagine that, Muslim would probably wear a skull cap and have beard, etc. But actually there is a huge difference in Muslims in India. They are not the same. And how are they different? So some of the ways in which they are different is, as I said, that they are different in terms of their religious practice. They are different in terms of their ethnic identities, right? So Muslims in different states will have different cultural practices and ethnic identities depending on their place of birth, right? It is interesting to understand that Muslims are also different on the basis of caste in India. Now, this often comes as a surprise because we tend to think that followers of Islam are all seen as, one community. It's seen as an egalitarian religion. But because a lot of Muslims in India, historical conversions, right? So as a result of that, there is what scholars point out about the casteization of Islam. Now, what do I mean by the casteization of Islam? Which means that there are certain kinds of caste differences in the Muslim society as well. And these differences emerge from a certain understanding of origin and occupation, as is the case with the Hindu caste system. Now, in the context of the Muslim caste system, in India, we can think of a threefold structure, which scholars have referred to as the Ashraf, the Ajlaf, and the Arzal. So the Ashrafs are generally thought to be those who are direct descendants and are basically, in some sense, migrants from various other countries, particularly the Middle East. And as you know, that there have been various waves of, sort of Islamic entry into India prior to the Mughal period, during the Mughal period, and thereafter. So the Ashrafs are seen as those who are originally Muslims. They have not converted, they have simply migrated, right? Often Being Ashraf is also associated with nobility, it is associated with the elite group, and also the middle class faction is often seen in terms of the Ashraf identity. Then there are two other important categories. First is the Ajlaf. The Ajlaf are basically lower and middle caste converts, which means that these were Hindus who later at some point in history converted to Islam, and they were from the lower to the middle castes, and they are referred to as Ajlaf. And finally, we have those conversions which were conversions from the depressed classes, which means those caste groups which were seen as necessarily polluted, involved in polluted occupation. When these groups converted, they were referred to as Arzals. So you see, there is a kind of casteization of Islam in India, and this has consequences for the social, political, and economic experiences of Muslims in India. Now, because of these threefold division, it is important to understand that the Ashraf constitutes within this minority a much smaller group, and the majority of Muslims in India would perhaps fall into the category of the Ajlaf and the Arzal, and hence they are also socially, economically, and politically backward groups. It is also in this context important to understand and recognize the fact that as per the constitution, Muslims do not have access to reservations, right? And as I've already mentioned, that this emerged from this anxiety that, because of the kind of things that happened during partition, the Constitution of India did not want to have any policy that would favor any particular religion. And hence what you get is that Muslims have certain rights in India as a minority, including the right, for instance, to manage their civil affairs. So, for instance, in India, we have the Sharia laws that are used in the context of civil issues of Muslims. There isn't, although the constitution wants to establish at some point a uniform civil code, but so far that has not happened. So, what we then see is that the Muslim community in India is a very heterogeneous community. It is a heterogeneous community in terms of practice, in terms of language, in terms of distribution, and also in terms of caste, as I have discussed. Now, keeping this in mind, how does caste operate apart from the three distinctions that I talked to you about? So, how are they maintained? One way in which caste is maintained among Muslims is, of course, like it is in the case of castes among the Hindus, it is through the practice of endogamy. What is the practice of endogamy? Which means groups which try to marry in the same group and not outside, right? So in a similar way, what would happen is that even among Muslims, there may be a sense that, this is a Muslim person but does not belong to my caste group, and hence there may be a kind of discontinuing of marital relations. So endogamy can be a common practice by which these caste relations can be replicated among the Muslims of India. Because some of the Muslims who have converted from groups that were economically backward, right? There is clearly a class division as well. There's a very small elite business class of Muslims in India, followed by a nascent middle class, and one of the reasons for this is a lot of the elite and the middle class actually migrated during the partition. So it was often then the more backward groups who were in India, right? And so there has been a kind of historical backwardness of the Muslim community in India because of the kind of differences that we can see, and particularly in the context of the casteization of the religion in Indian society. From the from 1980s, 1990s, there has always been this discussion about Muslim disempowerment in the country. The idea that Muslims are backward, the Muslims need development, they need upliftment, they need empowerment, they need certain forms of assistance, etc., is an issue that is raised from time to time, and there have been various reports which attest to the backwardness of Muslims, and one of the most important report to have come out about the Muslim experience in India is the Sachar Committee report of 2005. It was a report which was mandated by the central government, and in the report it does talk about the kind of Muslim backwardness that there exists in India, and it identifies educational, political and economic backwardness of Muslims in India. In terms of education, it is very clear that in the average literacy rate of Muslims in India is lesser than the average literacy rate of the Indian population. So there is a gap in terms of the education potential of Muslims. There is also this understanding that a lot of Muslims actually go to madrasas, and so they are not a part of the standard formal modern education system of India, and generally madrasas are seen as non-modern forms of education. But what the committee report actually established is only as less as 3% of Muslims in India actually study under the madrasa system. But the problem is that there are many Muslims who do not have access to education. So one of the ways to develop the Muslim community in Indian society is, of course, to encourage and ensure equitable access of Muslims to education. And what has been seen as there is a very strong decline of Muslim children educating themselves. So there is a decline from it keeps increasing as you go higher up in the education. So the representation of Muslims in higher education is very, very dismal. So in such a situation, the state obviously feels that there is a need to empower Muslims educationally. Now, various reports also suggest that particularly working class Muslim families, like recently there was a survey which was referred to as the SNAP survey in West Bengal, it suggested that poor Muslims, they do not give a lot of importance to education because they think that the returns to education is very marginal, which is to say that even if they get their children educated, they may not get adequate jobs. So hence the idea is that instead of getting educated, they start thinking of how best they can earn a livelihood and survive. This is of course not the case of all Muslims, because say middle class Muslims are obviously invested in a project of self-fashioning, where they are deeply invested in the understanding that Muslim development is contingent on education. So the state must play an important role and a proactive role in trying to ensure access, equitable access of quality education to Muslims. But what we realize is even after so many years, so from 1947 to 2005, the rates of literacy among Muslims is dismal, and so is their access to higher education. Similarly, if we think of that the status of a community can be talked about in terms of the kind of political representation that they have, what we realize is again that the political representation of Muslims is much less in Indian nation. What I mean by political representation is, say for instance, their representation in government jobs. How many Muslims are a part of civil services? How many Muslims are IS officers? How many Muslims are IFS officers? How many Muslims are in the police? And you realize that compared to their overall percentage of population in India, their representation in these political positions are actually much less. Say for instance, their participation in government jobs according to the 2011 census does not exceed 5%. It's for IS it's 3%, for IFS it's 1.8%, and for IPS it's 4%. And we have to keep in mind that the total population of Muslims is 14%. So you can see that there is this gap in representation. Likewise, another thing that we need to understand is that a majority of Muslims are actually engaged in the informal sector. So the informal sector is of course an insecure sector, which means that their economic activity, economic participation, the kind of jobs that they have access to are mostly working class jobs, mostly in the informal sector. Now, obviously, all of this in some sense are related to each other, because if the community does not have education, it obviously does not have access to a certain kind of job profile, and hence the only mode of survival becomes the informal economy. Add to this is the understanding that women's participation in the workforce for Muslim women is even lesser, right? So the Sachar committee clearly creates a picture of Muslim backwardness, where it states that despite some of the guarantees of the constitution, which try to safeguard the rights of religious minorities, not just Muslims but all religious minorities, despite these safeguards, because of the absence of reservation and the caste-like structures that are present in the Muslim society in India, what has happened is that there has been constant experience of Muslim backwardness, and it continues to this day. And this backwardness is educational, it is political as well as social. So the political, economic and educational backwardness that the Sachar report talks about, it uses another concept to explain the situation of Muslims in the country, and that concept is the concept of ghettoization. Now, what is ghettoization? Ghettoization is the concentration of Muslims in particular areas. Now, these are often backward areas. So the idea that backward groups are living and residing in backward areas, which are underdeveloped areas, which do not have all civic amenities, right? And there is this understanding that this ghettoization is something that is both from within, which means that there's a tendency of Muslims to to conglomerate together. Now, this may be for a variety of reasons. Scholars point out this is because they feel more secure, as a community when they live together, given the fact that, there has been an unfortunate history of communal riots in the country even after independence. So, as a result, a lot of Muslims are concentrated in particular areas. It is also imposed from without because as it is that they suffer from these political, economic and educational disprivileges, there is also a general perception of Muslims which is negative, and sometimes these negative perceptions of Muslims have led to certain kind of discrimination that have occurred. And as a result, also what happens is, say for instance, you will see in the news there is always this conversation around the struggles of, say, the Muslim middle class to rent places. So again, the idea that they struggle to find residence in areas other than where there are larger concentrations of Muslims. So clearly then what has happened is not only there are various kinds of social, economic and political backwardness that the Muslims are facing, but they are also being ghettoized. So the solution really is a way in which to ensure greater belonging and an acknowledgement of Muslims as very much a part and parcel of the nation. And the attempt of the state here becomes very crucial in actually addressing some of the social evils and the social ills that are afflicting the community, to create a set of infrastructure. They may not be, of course, reservations, although there are a lot of calls for various kinds of reservations. For instance, there is what is called the Pasmanda movement, which talks about how Muslims should get reservations, particularly the Arzals, those who are converts from the lowest of the caste, should get reservation under the ST category. Of course, some Muslims get reservation because they are a part of in the ST category as parts of tribes. And of course, after the Mandal Commission, as you know, with the affirmative action being extended to other backward caste, a lot of Muslims in various states are a part of the list of the other backward castes. So hence there also they are getting some kind of affirmative action from the state. So it is important to understand that the situation is complex, and there are the various states as well as the central government have been trying to uplift the community, but because there are these historical reasons for backwardness, the progress has not been up to the mark, but obviously there is always much that can be done. Thank you so much.